Welcome back to EDH on a Budget. I'm your host, Iceman, and today we're going to be going over the three different ways white ramps with the lands. Typically, white is not the color people go to fetch with tutor up their lands out of their deck, but white does have three different main ways of doing that. And today we're going to be going over the first path. The first path is what I like to call the bring back ramp. So these cards are all going to, in one way or another, bring lands out of the graveyard and onto the battlefield, and they typically have to enter the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, but that's not always a requirement for these cards. First up, we have Brought Back for $1.50. It's a white. It's a mana cost. It's an instant. Choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Return them to the battlefield tapped. So obviously this doesn't have to get lands, but what I like to do to ramp with this is to use a fetch land, some sort of land that sacrifices itself to tutor up another land. When it sacrifices itself, it goes to the graveyard, so this meets that requirement. There are lots of very cheap lands that can do this. There's a lot of panorama lands, the Nuka Panon lands, Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse. Fabled Passage is probably the cheapest, best budget card for fetching lands, because if you have 4 more, the land enters the battlefield untapped, and that's pretty convenient. Gonna add up mana a lot faster. Next up, we have Savine's Reclamation for 20 cents. I've already gone over this card, so I'm just gonna go over it briefly. It's a 2 and a white sorcery with flashback for 4 and white to be cast again from your graveyard. Return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the spell was cast from your graveyard, you may copy the spell. So lands have 0 mana cost. They don't have a mana cost, so it's 0, and you can use this for lands. I'm going to move on to Jailbreak, the next one, which is about 15 cents. It is a sorcery, 1 and a white. Return target permanent card in an opponent's graveyard to the battlefield under their control. When that permanent enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target permanent card with equal or lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So yes, an opponent is going to get something, and it is dependent that the opponent has a permanent card in their graveyard. But a lot of players use fetch lands to help fix their mana pool. So if you, in a 4-player game, if any one of them has a fetch land in the graveyard, or somebody's playing a mill deck, it's very easy to bring back one of their lands, and you bring back one of your lands. It's not going to put you ahead of that player. You're going to be tied with that player in that aspect, but the other 2 players it is going to put you ahead on. And this is a good way to build allies in a game. If you're playing a game with 3 other players and it's always 3 against 1, you're going to have a hard time winning if you brought a deck that's about the same power level. So don't underestimate politics. You could even make a deal like, oh, I'll bring back your Reclamation Sage if you destroy that thing over there that we don't like. Or I'll bring back a big stompy creature, just don't hit me with it. There's lots of ways to turn this political card into your favor. Next up, we have the Restoration of Aganjo. It is a saga that costs 2 and a white. It says, search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle for the first one. That's what happens when it enters the battlefield. The second one, when it hits the second lower counter, it says you may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if you discard that plains card that you just grabbed the previous turn, you can return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less. We've already been over lands have 0 mana value, so you can bring back that land to the battlefield tapped. So this is a little bit slower. Ramping on turn 3 is not as good or fast as green. Green can ramp on turns 1 and 2, typically 2. And you do gotta wait a turn for this to hit the second one. And the third one, it just exiles itself and returns to the battlefield transformed as a creature. As far as ramp is concerned, that's going to be irrelevant. And next, last but not least, we have Cosmic Intervention. This is the most expensive of this group at $2.80. It is a little pricey, but it can ramp like nothing else. This instant is 3 and a white. It says if a permanent you control would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, exile it instead. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, and it has foretell for 1 and a white, where you pay to exile it from your hand, and you could pay 1 and a white to cast it from exile. It adds up to the same, but it makes it so it's easier to cast. Potentially, you could cast this on turn 3 if you foretell it on 2. So even though you're paying 4 mana, you're breaking it up into payments, so you could play it earlier. I typically would recommend foretelling it into exile and casting it later, because 2 mana, great board wipe protection from anything that destroys, sacrifices, gives -1/-1 counters. The only thing it won't help against is a exile all board wipe. And here's how this card ramps. Since it says if a permanent you control would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Your end step is still your turn. So if you play this card and then you sack New Capenna land or Evolving Wilds, what happens is you go get that land that you tutored and goes onto the battlefield, but the one you sacrificed, we'll just say Obscura Storefront, one of the New Capenna lands. What's going to happen is you'll gain that life from the Obscura Storefront. The land will go into exile instead of your graveyard, and then at your end step, which is still during your turn, that land is going to come back to the battlefield. You're going to, if it's an Evolving Wild, you're going to tap it, sacrifice it again, look for another land. New Capenna lands automatically do this. You don't have to do anything. It's an enter the battlefield ability. So it would happen again at the beginning of your end step. So that's still during your turn. This Cosmic Intervention is still going to exile it that second time you use this. So you've used it twice now on your turn, and it will come back at the beginning of the next end step. So the next player's turn, at the beginning of their end step, that land will come back again. And it's still an Evolving Wilds or whatever you're at sacrifice, so you can tap it again. And Cosmic Intervention will no longer be in effect, but that one land will have gotten you 3 lands. So you got your regular land drop for the turn, plus 2 extra ones. And if this is in a landfall deck, that is a lot of landfall triggers. That would be 6 landfall triggers, which is a lot for just one card to do. And thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like, share, and subscribe button, and I'll be back next week with the second way, and I'll probably combine it because the second way's not a ton. It doesn't have a ton of cards. So we'll do 2 and 3 for the different ways white can ramp.